The day I discovered 60 fully occupied HOA homes sitting on land that legally belonged to my ranch, I thought there had to be some kind of mistake. Entire streets had been built behind a line of trees on acreage my family had owned for generations. Children were playing in yards, cars filled driveways, and residents went about their daily lives completely unaware that a massive property dispute was about to explode. What shocked me even more was what happened when I brought the issue to the HOA. Instead of investigating the situation, they accused me of harassment, threatened legal action, and insisted I had no claim to the land, despite the fact that I was holding documents proving otherwise. The how was holding story started after I inherited a large ranch that had been in my family for decades. The property covered thousands of acres and included sections that hadn't been inspected closely in years. While reviewing updated survey maps for a fencing project, I noticed something strange. One boundary line didn't match recent county aerial records. At first, I assumed it was a mapping error, but the more I looked, the more concerned I became. Several roads appeared to cross onto ranch property, and portions of an entire housing development seemed to extend far beyond where they should have been. Curious and increasingly worried, I hired a professional survey team to conduct a full review. A few weeks later, survey results arrived, and the findings were unbelievable. Nearly 60 homes belonging to a nearby HOA subdivision had been constructed on land legally included within my ranch boundaries. According to the records, the mistake had gone unnoticed through multiple ownership transfers, planning approvals, and construction phases. Somehow an entire neighborhood had expanded into property that was never sold, transferred, or legally acquired. The surveyors double-checked everything and reached the conclusion. Every time the land belonged to my ranch. At first, I tried handling the matter reasonably. I contacted HOA leadership and requested a meeting, expecting everyone would want to resolve the issue cooperatively. Instead, the board members dismissed the survey results almost immediately. They claimed their development had existed for years and argued that long-term use somehow gave them ownership rights. When I provided county records and title documents, they barely looked at them. One board member even laughed and suggested I stop wasting their time. The conversation ended with the HOA refusing to acknowledge the evidence and warning me not to interfere with the neighborhood. Over the following months, I continued gathering information. Attorneys reviewed deeds, surveyors confirmed boundaries, and county records consistently supported the same conclusion. Yet every attempt to discuss solutions was met with hostility. Then things became even worse. The HOA filed a lawsuit against me, claiming my efforts to assert ownership were damaging property values and causing emotional distress among residents. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The people occupying land that wasn't theirs were now suing the actual owner of that land. The lawsuit attracted attention throughout the county. Neighbors began choosing sides. Local officials started asking questions, and residents living in the subdivision slowly learned details they had never been told before. But while reviewing additional RDS for the legal case, my attorneys discovered something that changed everything. Hidden within decades-old easement documents was a detail so important that the entire lawsuit suddenly looked very different. And when the HOA realized what that document meant, panic spread through the neighborhood faster than anyone could have imagined. When my attorneys finished reviewing the easement records, they called me immediately and asked me to come to their office. The urgency in their voices told me this was important. When I arrived, they read several old maps and legal documents across the conference table. At first, the paperwork looked ordinary: property descriptions, survey notes, county filings. Then one attorney pointed to a highlighted section buried deep within an easement agreement that had been recorded decades earlier. The document changed everything. According to the records, the only legal roadway connecting the HOA subdivision to the public highway crossed a section of my ranch. The AAOA residents had access because previous owners of the ranch had voluntarily allowed it through a limited use agreement. The agreement contained specific conditions, and one condition stood out above all others. If the easement became the subject of legal interference against the property owner, it could be challenged and terminated through proper legal procedures. The room became silent for months. The HOA had been suing the very person whose land provided their primary access route, the Significa. NCI was enormous. Without that easement, the subdivision would face a serious problem. My attorneys immediately began examining whether the HOA's actions had triggered provisions allowing the agreement to be revoked. The more they researched, the stronger the case became. Meanwhile, the lawsuit continued. The HOA board remained confident. They publicly insisted they would win. Residents were told not to worry. Board members repeatedly claimed my ranch had no valid ownership interest in the disputed land. But behind the scenes, things were beginning to unravel during the legal discovery process. Additional records emerged: survey maps, planning documents, development files, internal communications. Every new document seemed to create more questions for the HOA. Several records suggested that warning GS about boundary issues had appeared years earlier, yet those concerns had never been properly addressed. Then came the first major court hearing. The courtroom was packed. Residents filled seats. Report RS attended. Local officials watched closely. Everyone wanted to know how an entire neighborhood had ended up inside a property dispute of this size. As evidence was presented, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The survey data was clear. The title records were clear. The ownership history was clear. The disputed land belonged to the ranch. The HOA attorneys attempted to challenge the findings, but each argument ran into the same problem. The documentation was overwhelming. By the end of the hearing, many residents looked stunned. For the first time, they were hearing evidence that directly contradicted what they had been told for years. Outside the courthouse, homeowners gathered in small groups, discussing what they had learned. Questions spread quickly. People wanted answers. Many residents had purchased homes believing everything had been properly approved. Now uncertainty filled the neighborhood. Then my attorneys filed a separate action regarding the roadway easement. That filing changed the tone of the entire dispute. News traveled fast. Residents learned that the access route they depended on crossed ranch property. They learned the easement existed because of agreements tied to the ranch, and they learned those agreements were now under review. Panic started spreading. Homeowners began contacting the HOA board demanding explanations. Community meetings became chaotic. Attendance reached record levels. People wanted to know how leadership had allowed the situation to become so serious. Board members struggled to provide answers. Some attempted to blame developers. Others blamed previous boards. Others blamed county officials, but every explanation created more frustration. The trust that once existed was disappearing as legal proceedings continued. Negotiations finally began. The attitude from HOA changed completely. The same board that once laughed at survey records now wanted meetings. The same people who had dismissed ownership documents now wanted compromise. The difference was obvious. Reality had finally caught up with them. Months earlier, they believed they could simply ignore the evidence. Now they understood the consequences. One meeting lasted nearly 10 hours. Lawyers reviewed maps. Surveyors reviewed boundaries. Engineers reviewed access routes. Solutions were discussed. Options were debated. The situation remained complicated because residents themselves were not responsible for creating the problem. Most homeowners had purchased their properties in good faith. They had relied on information provided during development. Many were victims of the situation as much as anyone else. That reality became an important factor in discussions. Eventually, a framework for resolution started taking shape. Land use agreements were reconsidered. Boundary corrections were proposed. Compensation discussions began, and most importantly, a path forward emerged that protected homeowners while acknowledging legal ownership rights. But one thing remained clear throughout the process: the HOA's lawsuit had backfired spectacularly. What began as an attempt to pressure me into abandoning my claim had instead exposed years of mistakes. Had they simply met with me when I first brought the survey results, they might have resolved everything quietly. Instead, they escalated the conflict. They filed lawsuit. They ignored evidence, and they forced issues into public view. Years later, people still talk about the dispute, not because of the legal arguments, not because of the surveys, but because of one simple lesson: facts do not disappear just because someone refuses to acknowledge them. The HOA believed ownership could be changed through confidence and threats. The records proved otherwise. and the moment the easement documents surfaced, the balance of power shifted completely, standing on the ranch one evening, watching the sun set across the same land my family had owned for generations. I thought about how close the situation came to becoming much worse. In the end, patience, documentation, and persist. NCE accomplished what anger never could. The truth was already written in the records. Someone simply had to read them. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. We upload new stories every day, and your support helps the channel grow. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.